The public saw a smiling Camilla at Windsor. But behind palace walls, the air was ice cold. Something had shifted subtly, then violently. A single letter, hidden for decades, emerged from the shadows, and with it, an earthquake of emotion. Was it planted, forgotten, or worse, was it never meant to be found? This was no ordinary note, it was a confession, and Camilla had just read it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. On the surface, everything appeared perfectly poised. Camilla attended a ceremonial engagement at Windsor Castle, draped in regal elegance and poise, the epitome of a royal consort. She smiled when required, nodded at dignitaries, exchanged pleasantries with foreign guests. But those watching closely noticed something beneath the polished facade, her gaze, distant, her steps slightly unsteady. The very energy around her felt chilled. Palace aides whispered in corridors, alarmed by her sudden change. The queen consort, once fiercely composed, had become unnervingly withdrawn. Meals went untouched. Her conversations shortened to nods and murmurs. No one dared ask why. The truth lay buried not in emotion, but in a forgotten piece of history. Days earlier, renovations had begun in a less frequented corner of Clarence House. A dusty trunk, long ignored, was shifted from an attic storage room by palace staff. Inside, photo albums, old invitations, a faded velvet pouch, and one envelope, yellowed with age, sealed tightly and marked with no name. Out of quiet curiosity or perhaps an unexplainable pull, Camilla asked for the trunk to be delivered to her private quarters. Hours passed before she even touched it, and when she did, it was with trembling hands and a sinking gut. She sat alone in silence, barely breathing, as she broke the seal. Her fingers unfolded the brittle paper, the ink slightly smudged with time. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, her entire body stiffened. Each word cut deeper than the last. Her breath hitched. Her fingers gripped the letter tighter, wrinkling the edges as though bracing herself from a fall. Her face, usually unreadable, crumpled into disbelief. There was pain and rage and something more haunting. And then she reached the end. There, scrawled in familiar cursive, was a name she could never forget, Diana. It was signed without flourish, but it screamed louder than any scream. The late Princess of Wales had written this, and it had somehow landed in Camilla's home, in her hands, in her life. Shock rooted her to the chair, grief tightened around her chest, and betrayal, piercing, paralyzing, unfurled like wildfire through her veins. She read it again, slower this time, as if trying to make sense of the impossible, but the words didn't change. They never would. The truth had been waiting, quiet, patient, deadly. But what did the letter actual lie say? And why did it shake Camilla, the woman who's seen it all to her core? Imagine reading the deepest confessions of a woman long gone, a woman whose presence still lingers in every hall, every gaze, every headline. Diana's letter was not just emotional, it was explosive, and now Camilla held it, alone. There was no mistaking the handwriting, the loops, the urgency, the slanted pressure of the pen. It was undeniably Diana's. Time had not faded the ink, nor dulled the raw ache seeping from every sentence. It wasn't composed like a royal letter, prim and proper. It was a bleeding wound on paper. It trembled with emotion, each word screaming from a place of isolation, despair, and a woman who had long given up on being heard. It wasn't addressed to Charles, nor to her sons. In fact, it bore no greeting at all, only words carved into the silence like a scream trapped in a jar. Camilla's breath caught. She realized this wasn't a note, it was a storm, and she had step, ped into its eye. The first lines were personal, almost mundane. Diana spoke of sleepless nights, of eyes watching her even in the silence, of shadows in mirrors and smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. But then the tone sharpened. There were mentions of conversations that didn't feel like hers to hear, secrets passed in hushed tones near the nursery wing, and a sense that decisions about her life, about her very existence within the monarchy, had already been made by others. She spoke of betrayal, but not the obvious kind, not the affair the world obsessed over. This was deeper, more orchestrated, and it was here, buried in these pages, that Camilla felt something cold settle over her. Diana hadn't written this in anger. She'd written it in clarity. One line punched through the paper like a scream. One day she'll know, and when she does, it will all unravel. Camilla read that line again. And again. Was Diana speaking of her? There was no name, but the implication was clear. The letter wasn't a random memory dump, it was a time capsule, waiting to detonate. She wasn't meant to find it. Not like this, maybe not ever. But now it was in her hands, and every word was a blade. And then came the line that made her stomach churn, the shadow that was always there. A cruel turn of phrase, unnamed but unmistakable. Camilla had been watching from the sidelines for years before she stepped into the light, and Diana knew it. She had always known it. Every charity event, every forced family photo, every awkward dinner with unspoken tension, it all suddenly felt like a slow-burning trap. And the letter was its final snap. But the most chilling part was not about emotion, it was about control. In the final paragraph, Diana implied something far more sinister, that her fate, her silence, had been part of an agreement. Not just with Charles, but with someone else. A hidden pact, an arrangement struck behind curtains and smiles to protect the institution. The exact words were veiled, intentionally vague, but the implications were thunderous. There was more than heartbreak here. There was orchestration, sacrifice, a bargain, one made for survival. And now Camilla was left wondering whether she was ever anything more than a pawn in someone else's design. Her heart pounded, mind spinning, eyes stinging. The paper in her hands was shaking, though her grip had never tightened. For a moment she didn't know who she was more angry at, Diana for writing it, or Charles for what might lie behind it. But if Diana wrote this, who was meant to read it, and why was it hidden in Camilla's own home? The letter hinted at something unthinkable, an arrangement, a pact, a compromise struck in the dead of night, a deal that would ensure royal survival, at the cost of truth and love. At first, Camilla tried to dismiss it as grief speaking through ink, a wounded woman reaching for meaning where none existed. But the more she reread those final lines, heavier they became. Words like agreement, understanding, and necessary silence were not the language of heartbreak. They were the language of negotiation, of power, of politics. And suddenly, the letter no longer felt like a confession. It felt like evidence. That night, while the palace slept and the corridors whispered with old ghosts, Camilla began to search. She moved quietly, deliberately, through rooms she had shared with Charles for years but had never truly known. Drawers opened that had not been touched in decades. Locked cabinets yielded folders marked only with dates and initials. In the back of a writing desk, beneath old correspondence and brittle photographs, she found a leather-bound diary she'd never seen before. Charles's handwriting filled the pages, disciplined and guarded, but scattered between mundane entries were fragments that stopped her cold. The pact holds. Her compliance is essential. Her silence must be protected at all costs. The words we were never explained, never elaborated on, but they appeared again and again, like a drumbeat beneath the surface of his life. And then, buried within a thin folder wedged behind a false panel in the study, she found the phrase written clearly, unmistakably, three-person negotiation, Her Majesty present. The Queen, Charles, and Diana. Camilla's pulse thundered in her ears as realization crept in, slow and merciless. This was not just a family scandal. This had reached the very top. The monarchy itself had intervened. Somewhere, long before the public ever knew the marriage was doomed, a decision had been made. Not to save love, not to save Diana, but to save the crown. Piece by piece, the terms revealed themselves through fragments and implications. Charles would be free eventually to live as he wished. Camilla would remain in the shadows, unseen, unheard, waiting. And Diana would endure, smile, appear, remain compliant for the sake of stability. In return, the monarch. She would protect her image, control the narrative, and ensure the institution survived untouched. One clause chilled Camilla more than the rest. Public perception must override private consequence. The words were merciless, cold, absolute. Human suffering was not a tragedy in this agreement, it was collateral. And then the final blow landed, quietly but with devastating force. In a margin note, barely legible, was a line that changed everything. Camilla not to be informed object, not party. She wasn't a participant. She wasn't consulted. She wasn't even trusted. She had not been part of the agreement at all. She had been the reason for it, the problem to be managed, the temptation to be contained, the woman around whom the entire arrangement revolved without ever granting her a voice. For years, she had believed herself complicit, guilty, the villain of a tragic love triangle. But now, as the weight of the truth settled over her, a different reality emerged. She had been used, positioned, maneuvered into silence without consent. Even her eventual marriage, her place beside the king, suddenly felt less like destiny, and more like the final stage of a design drawn decades earlier. The crown had survived. Charles had been granted his freedom. Diana had paid the price. And Camilla, she had inherited the consequences. Her hands lowered slowly, the papers slipping back into the folder as her thoughts raced ahead, spiraling toward a future that now felt unfamiliar and dangerous. Trust cracked. Memory rewrote itself. Every conversation, every reassurance from Charles, now echoed with doubt. If this had been hidden for so long, what else was still buried? And that realization shattered something inside her, but she wasn't done searching. A queen consort doesn't raise her voice in the palace until now. What began as grief turned into rage, and Camilla wanted answers. Not from a servant, not from an aide, from the king himself. She didn't knock, she didn't pause. The doors to Charles's private chamber flew open with a force no one in the palace had ever seen from her. In her hand, the letter trembled not from fear but fury. Her voice, once reserved and deliberate, now thundered through the marble halls. Charles turned slowly, startled not by her entrance, but by the sheet of paper she held. He saw it instantly. His face blanched. Diana's handwriting was unmistakable. He didn't need to read a word to know exactly what it was. The silence stretched as Camilla approached, her eyes burning with questions she never thought she'd have to ask. There was no time for pleasantries. She demanded the truth. Had he seen this letter before? Had he known of its existence? And if he had he tried to bury it? Charles faltered. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment he tried to regain control, tried to deflect, to downplay. But Camilla wasn't having it. Her voice sharpened with every syllable. "This was in our home," she said through clenched teeth. "Not in a museum. Not in an archive. Here, hidden. Why?" Charles attempted to explain. He stumbled over words about long-lost possessions and misfiled belongings, but the cracks were showing. His composure, his certainty, it all began to unravel. And when he finally spoke with clarity, it wasn't a denial, it was a confession. Yes, he admitted, he had known about the pact. Not the letter, not the specific words Diana had left behind, but the agreement she had referenced, the unholy understanding between the crown, the marriage and the monarchy. He had known it existed, he had been part of it, and he had tried desperately to move forward without ever revisiting what it had cost them all. Camilla's fury surged. "You buried her and the truth in the same breath," she snapped. "And now you expect peace?" Charles's voice rose too, at last, the pressure boiling over. He called her obsession dangerous, said she was digging up ghosts that were best left alone. But that only ignited her more. "It was buried in our home," she shouted, shaking the letter in the air. The ghosts were always here. That room, filled with portraits and polished wood, suddenly felt like a crypt filled not just with echoes of Diana, but with every lie that had cemented the walls around them. Camilla wasn't just confronting a man. She was confronting an institution, a legacy built on sacrifice and silence. Charles stood in stunned silence as she left the room, letter still in hand, her faith in him fractured. The tension didn't fade when the door closed, it thickened, spreading through the palace like smoke. Because if Charles had hidden that much, what else had been kept from her? And what more was waiting to be found? Camilla's fury had found a target, but her trust was now gone. And the letter wasn't the only thing she had uncovered. What if the letter was only the beginning? What if Diana left behind more than paper? As Camilla digs deeper into the past, a box high, Dadden inside a piano bench reveals tapes, and they would shake the palace to its knees. The silence of Clarence's house had never felt louder. Camilla moved like a woman possessed, no longer searching for comfort, but for truth. Every drawer, every crevice, every storage chest was a potential vault of secrets now. And then, beneath the dusty lid of an old piano bench tucked away in a forgotten corner of the drawing room, she found it a worn velvet pouch, its threads fraying with time. Inside, a small tape recorder, the kind used before technology got sleek and clever, and next to it, microcassettes. 5 of them, each labelled in Diana's slanted handwriting, Private 1996. Camilla's breath caught in her throat. Whatever was on those tapes had been hidden deliberately, and for good reason. With trembling fingers, she played the first one. Diana's voice crackled to life, soft and shaking. Not the poised, camera-ready Princess of Wales the world remembered, but a woman on Reveille. In real time, a woman cornered, broken, confessing into the dark. The pain was immediate. Her words weren't rehearsed. They spilled like water from a cracked dam. She spoke of isolation, of corridors that echoed with silence, of conversations she was never meant to hear. The manipulation was subtle, she said. Psychological, strategic. There was always someone watching, always someone correcting. One entry stopped Camilla cold. Diana whispered about feeling surveilled, not by the press, but by those closest to her. She wondered if she was being gaslit by the palace itself. The tapes continued, each one peeling back another layer. In one of the final recordings, Diana's tone changed, not angry, not bitter, but devastatingly calm. She spoke about Camilla. Not in blame, but in curiosity. Maybe she doesn't even know, Diana whispered. Maybe she thinks she chose this. Maybe she was placed here long before she realized it. Camilla froze. It wasn't an accusation, it was a revelate. Ion. Diana hadn't seen her as the enemy, but as another casualty, another woman dragged into a royal machine designed to preserve power, not people. By the end of the third tape, Camilla could no longer hold back the emotion. A tear rolled down her cheek as she listened to Diana's final thoughts, full of sorrow, yes, but also startling clarity. This wasn't a vengeful woman speaking from the grave. This was a mother, a wife, a prisoner of duty trying to make sense of her own erasure. It hit Camilla with brutal force. Diana's suffering hadn't been exaggerated by tabloids or dramatized by public memory, it had been understated. Sanitized. The truth was uglier, and quieter, and crueler. The tapes were more than historical artifacts. They were warnings. They revealed not only what had happened, but why it kept happening. Camilla was no longer just unraveling Diana's story, she was becoming a part of it. The boundaries between past and present, victim and villain, had begun to kernel, lapse. There was no neutral ground anymore, only truths that demanded to be faced or buried again. But sympathy wasn't enough, because these tapes didn't just speak of the past. They held a warning for the future. Camilla didn't know the tapes had already reached someone else. One brother had heard them, the other refused. And between William and Harry, the ghosts of their mother would drive the final nail into their shattered bond. For days, Camilla had sat alone, listening to Diana's voice echo through the chambers of Clarence's house, the tapes revealing wounds far deeper than the public ever saw. But what she didn't know, what no one had told her, was that the voice she had uncovered was not entirely lost to time. William had already heard it, years ago. The tapes, or at least copies of them, had been quietly passed to him by a former royal butler, a man who'd once sworn allegiance to Diana and in the end chose to preserve her truth. William, ever the heir, had tous, kept them away in a vault of silence, refusing to let their contents disrupt the image the monarchy had worked so hard to restore. But in doing so, he sealed away a truth his brother never got to hear. Harry had once asked about the tapes. Just after his marriage, just before his departure from the firm, he had come to Charles, seeking clarity, maybe even healing. But the king had looked him in the eye and told him they had all been destroyed. A necessary measure, he'd claimed, to protect everyone's dignity. Harry had believed it. At the time, he wanted to believe it. And so the truth stayed hidden until Camilla found it and shattered the illusion. When Camilla confronted William, it wasn't with rage, it was with disbelief. She showed him the tapes, expecting shock. Instead, he looked away, quietly admitting he had known for some time, that he had heard Diana's voice, that he had chosen silence. "I couldn't let them define her," he muttered, "or us." But that explanation felt hollow, because in choosing silence, he had also chosen betrayal, not just of Harry, but of Diana's final wishes. The moment Harry found out was not calm, it was not private, it was a detonation. He learned the truth not from his brother, not from his father, but from a quiet admission Camilla made, trying to protect what little trust remained. And with that one sentence, the last bridge between the brothers burned. Harry's devastation was immediate. This wasn't about duty, it was about truth being stolen from him. Again, first his mother, now her final words. And in the center of it all stood Camilla, no longer just the woman who married their father. Now once again, the symbol of everything unspoken. To William, she was the reminder of mistakes that couldn't be erased. To Harry, she became a symbol of deception, of a family that had chosen survival over sincerity. The tapes weren't just recordings, they were matches dropped on old gasoline. Every every whispered confession Diana made into that recorder now echoed in the brothers' lives, and they could not hear them the same way. Old wounds reopened, grudges resurfaced. Conversations once paused for the sake of peace reignited with venom. The tension between the brothers, already volatile, exploded. And for Camilla, who had spent decades trying to step into the light, the shadows wrapped around her once more. Not because of what she did, but because of what she had uncovered. As the family fractures once again, Camilla begins to realize she's been cast as the villain in a play she didn't write. For the first time in her royal life, Camilla speaks. Not to the press, not to the palace, but to herself in a voice memo that was never meant to be heard. A confession not of guilt, but of grief. It was sometime past midnight when she pressed record. Alone, with the palace asleep and the weight of truth finally pressing down on her shoulders, Camilla whispered into a device, "Ta." Tea had never been meant for royal hands. Her voice was steady at first, but low, heavy, edged with a sorrow she had spent a lifetime learning to conceal. "I don't even know who I am in all this," she began, her tone stripped of titles, stripped of grandeur. "I thought I did. I thought love was enough." There was a long pause. You could almost hear her heart cracking. And then she continued, slower now, as if the words were dragging themselves out of her. "I loved him. I still do. But I never understood what it would cost." For years, Camilla had been painted in monochrome, the other woman, the intruder, the constant shadow behind Diana's glow. But now, in the dead quiet of her confession, she peeled it all back. She didn't deny her love for Charles, but what she did confess shook through the palace like thunder through stone. "He chose me," she said, "but not truth, not honesty, and not peace. Maybe he never really chose at all. Maybe we were all just pieces of something too big to see clearly." Her voice wavered slightly when she said Diana's name. And when she spoke of her, it wasn't with rivalry, but revelation. "She wasn't my enemy," Camilla said, barely above a whisper. "She was trapped too, by the same palace, the same man, the same duty that devoured anything soft, anything real." She paused again, and when she spoke next, her voice broke completely. "We were both betrayed. The difference is, she didn't survive it." That was the sentence, the one that carried the weight of 3 decades. It wasn't a defense, it was a reckoning, one that came far too late. The letter had been the beginning of the unraveling, but what followed was something else entirely. A peeling away of illusions, a brutal acknowledgement that the narrative she'd clung to of enduring love, of rightful place, was built on silence, secrets, and sacrifices she hadn't even realized she'd made. All this time, she said, "I thought I knew the truth, but I only ever saw what I was allowed to see." Her words weren't angry, they were mournful, empty in the way a person sounds when they've run out of explanations. And then, quietly, with the kind of brutal clarity only a woman staring at her past could muster, she ended the recording. "If I'd known, I would have walked away. 6 words that carried the weight of everything she had endured, inherited, and lost. But they were too late, too quiet, because the story was no longer hers to control. But now she couldn't walk away, because the letter was no longer secret, someone had leaked it. It hit the tabloids like a thunderclap. Diana's final letter found in Camilla's home. The headlines didn't care about nuance, the world wanted a villain, and once again, it was her. The leak came from within. Somewhere deep inside palace walls, someone had taken what was private, painful, and never meant for public eyes and fed it to the press. Within hours, the story had exploded. Every major outlet plastered Diana's name AC. Ross their front pages, accompanied by the same haunting phrase she warned us. The contents of the letter, twisted and reassembled for maximum damage, painted a chilling narrative. Diana as the ghostly prophet, Camilla as the orchestrator of silent ruin. Context vanished, compassion evaporated. What remained was a storm, and Camilla was at its center. Social media ignited like dry brush under a match. Hashtags surged across platforms, hashtag Diana's voice, hashtag Camilla must go, hashtag justice for Diana. Armchair critics dissected every word of the leaked letter, twisting its ambiguities into certainties. Every pause in Diana's voice, every tear in her interviews was replayed in slow motion. Every moment Camilla had ever been photographed smiling was reframed as mockery. It wasn't just backlash, it was retribution. A public reckoning decades in the making. And while the media fed the frenzy, the people made it personal. Old outage returned like a flood. Diana greeting children, Diana crying in. Interviews. Diana walking alone outside Kensington Palace. And spliced between those moments Camilla. Always in shadow, always in silence, now painted with a cruel brush. Editorials asked whether the Queen Consort had ever truly been accepted. Polls questioned if she should remain at all. Commentators speculated that this wasn't just about the past, it was about the legacy the Crown was trying to whitewash. Outside Buckingham Palace, the grief turned into fire. Crowds began to gather, not just in mourning but in fury. Flowers piled along the gates like they had decades before, but this time, the messages were different. She warned us. Not our queen. Step down. Homemade signs bobbed above the heads of the furious, some demanding abdication, others crying for truth. The atmosphere was electric, volatile history repeating itself with a vengeance. Inside, Camilla remained silent. No statement, no denial, no attempt to defend herself. But inside her private chambers, the silence was anything but calm. She was unraveling. The letter had already cracked something deep within her, but now with the world bearing down, with Diana's memory weaponized once more, that crack had become a chasm. Doubt poisoned every memory. Had she been blind to the damage? Had she believed in a version of love that was never hers to claim? Every headline felt like a blade, every image of Diana, a ghost reclaiming her space. Meanwhile, Charles's team scrambled, meetings behind closed doors, press officers in crisis mode, strategists debating the monarchy's survival in whispers. The idea that had once been unthinkable was now being whispered with growing urgency. Abdication. Could the king weather this storm with Camilla by his side? Could the monarchy survive if he didn't act? He paced halls haunted by 2 women, one gone, one fading before his eyes. His advisors demanded a decision. And just when it couldn't get worse, the king made a decision that changed everything. No statement, no press conference, just a silent motorcade leaving the gates of Clarence House. Camilla was gone. And the king was alone. The marriage wasn't over, but it was hanging by a thread. It was the kind of exit only royalty could manage, invisible, unannounced, and yet heard around the world. The official line was diplomatic. The Queen Consort had taken leave for reasons of health and reflection, a phrase carefully crafted to conceal the chaos behind the curtain. But the truth rang louder than any headline. This wasn't a retreat, it was a fracture, quiet, strategic, unmistakable. Camilla had disappeared from the stage she had fought decades to stand vanishing into the countryside with no staff, no entourage, and no indication of when or if she'd return. Her destination? A private estate in Cornwall, isolated, guarded, surrounded by silence. It was the first time in years she had chosen to be truly alone, and maybe the first time she'd needed to be. Inside the palace, the absence felt like a wound. Advisors tiptoed through rooms once filled with tension, now stripped of even that. Charles, the once commanding monarch, had gone nearly mute. Cabinet briefings passed with nods, international calls were postponed, formal appearances trimmed to the bare minimum. One aide leaked that he spent long hours in the same chamber where Camilla had confronted him with Diana's letter, sitting still, eyes fixed on nothing. But the most jarring change wasn't his silence, it was what he wore. A small, simple signet ring, unmistakably Diana's, now on his little finger. No explanation, no context. Just an image, and with it, a thousand questions. Was it guilt? Nostalgia? A message? Or was it an acknowledgement that the past he had tried so hard to bury had finally surfaced, and nothing he wore now could shield him from it? Speculation consumed the press, the public, and even the palace itself. Some whispered of a king unraveling, others believed it was an act of penance, a private tribute to the woman he couldn't protect or love in the way she needed. But behind the symbolism, the reality was clear. The monarchy, once steady even in its scandal, now trembled from the inside out. And then came the note. Just 7 words, handwritten. Unearthed not through a press release but through a quiet delivery to the BBC. No crest, no seal, just ink on parchment, simple and devastating. I have read her words. I understand. Signed Camilla. It said everything and explained nothing. It didn't apologize, it didn't confess, but it surrendered. In that moment the world didn't see a queen consort. It saw a woman. Who had been transformed by truth. A woman who had stepped into history only to be swallowed by it. The letter she never should have found had rewritten her entire place in the royal narrative, and now there was no returning to the story they had once tried so hard to control. The monarchy staggered beneath the weight of revelation, not because of a scandal, not because of affairs or divorces or headlines, but because of something far more dangerous, a memory. A truth long buried that refused to stay silent. What Diana left behind wasn't just pain, it was a reckoning, and it had arrived, years too late but right on time, in the form of a woman who finally saw the cost of everything she once believed was hers. Camilla remained in Cornwall. No photographs, no sightings, no whispers of reconciliation. And Charles remained in London. 2 figures, once united under a crown, now orbiting each other from a distance neither one had prepared for. The palace maintained its routine. The guards still stood tall, the portraits still hung, but something beneath the surface had shifted forever. The illusion of control had cracked, and in its place, a new truth settled in silent, unspoken, but unrelenting. The past never dies. It waits patiently, powerfully for the moment it can return. And when it does, even the mightiest crowns begin to tremble. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.